She had never planned to go to that fancy event. It was a gala, full of shiny dresses, rich people, and cameras flashing all night. But her best friend had begged her to come, said it would be good for her to see another side of life. She was just a nurse, working double shifts in a busy hospital in Atlanta. Most of her days were filled with noise, pain, and patients crying for help. That night, she had worn her best dress, simple but elegant, and borrowed a pair of heels too tight for her toes. She walked in feeling nervous but hopeful, telling herself she belonged just like everyone else. He noticed her almost immediately. She had something most people in the room didn't. A kind, calm face and eyes that looked like she had seen the world and still smiled. He was tall, confident, and dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than her car. She didn't know who he was, just that he smiled at her in a way that wasn't fake. He walked over and introduced himself, and she laughed at how he mispronounced her name. They started talking like old friends, forgetting where they were. They joked about the tiny appetizers, the snobby looks, and how she had almost slipped. In her heels, she was surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. People started whispering. Not everyone liked what they saw. A black woman in a nurse's dress, laughing with the son of one of the richest families in the city. They tried to ignore the stares, but she could feel the heat of judgment on her back. Still, he didn't leave her side. He introduced her to others with pride, like she was the most important person in the room. She could see the tight smiles on the faces of his parents from across the hall. They watched her like she was a problem waiting to happen. After the gala, he asked to walk her to her car. She said yes, though her feet were already begging for rest. They talked again under the night sky, this time slower, softer. He told her he admired how she saved lives, how she had chosen a hard but honest path. She told him he was not what she expected from a rich man. He seemed real. Before they said goodbye, he asked if he could call her sometime. She smiled and gave him her number, not expecting much. People like him didn't usually stay around, she thought, but he did. Days passed, and he called. Then came the flowers, the late-night calls, the long drives just to see her after work. She started looking forward to his messages more than sleep. He took her to places she'd never been: quiet gardens, museums at night, secret jazz bars, but he never treated her like a project or something to show off. He just listened, laughed, and held her hand like it was the most natural thing. She started to fall for him, slowly, then all at once. Even when people whispered, even when she saw the looks in fancy restaurants, she stayed close, because with him, she felt like more than just a nurse. More than just a black girl from the South. She felt seen, really seen, but behind his smile, behind the love growing between them, something dark was hiding. His parents had noticed everything, and they didn't like it. They had their own plans. For him, someone rich, someone white, someone who knew how to act like a lady in front of the media. They saw her as a threat, not because of who she was inside, but because of what she looked like. His mother called her sweet in front of others, but the words always felt sharp, like tiny knives under velvet. His father never even spoke to her, just nodded stiffly, like she was a waitress passing drinks. She tried not to let it hurt, but every silence from them felt louder than words. He noticed it too, but said nothing at first. He was trying to protect her, trying to believe love would be enough. She wanted to believe that too. But one night, after a dinner party where his mother accidentally called her the wrong name twice, she sat in her car for 10 minutes, hands on the wheel, heart full of tears she refused to let fall. She wasn't sure if she could live like this, fighting to be accepted every time she walked into his world. Still, she didn't want to give up. He made her feel something rare and beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. But that was only the beginning. She didn't know yet what his parents were truly capable of. She didn't know about the papers they were already preparing. She didn't know her life would soon be flipped upside down by secrets she never saw coming. That night at the gala had been magical. But it was also the quiet start of a storm that would test everything: her love, her pride, her very identity, and the worst part was, she still had no idea who her real father was or how his name alone could tear down the wall between rich and poor, black and white, hate and truth. But soon, she would find out. She hadn't expected his call the next day, but there it was, soft and kind. As if he had been thinking about her all night. He said her laugh stayed in his head, and her eyes were clearer than any diamond he'd ever seen. She laughed again, unsure if it was a real compliment or just rich man talk. But something about his voice felt sincere. They began talking every day after that, late-night calls that stretched into sleepy mornings. She would come home after a long shift, her body tired, but her fingers full of life, just waiting to text him. He never made her feel small, not once. Not even when she talked about her rent issues, her tired shoes, or her sick patients. He just listened, really listened, like every word from her mattered. One evening, he showed up outside the hospital with 2 hot coffees and a blanket. She was shocked to see him there, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, far from the suit-wearing man she met at the gala. He sat with her on a bench under a flickering street lamp, warming her hands with his. That was when she realized he wasn't playing. He wasn't chasing her for fun or to make a point. He liked her for real. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe it might be okay to hope again. They started spending weekends together, but never at his family estate. He would always come to her tiny apartment, the one with the squeaky floor and peeling paint. He helped her fix her kitchen sink and once cooked her burnt spaghetti, just to make her laugh. They talked about dreams, not just the big ones, but the little ones too, like wanting a dog or painting her bedroom sky blue. She found comfort in the simple things with him, like how he held her hand while driving, or whispered her name when she fell asleep. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw something strong and gentle, a mix she never thought existed in real men. But he was hiding her from his family. Not on purpose, he said, but to keep the peace for now. At first, she understood, thinking maybe he just needed more time. But time kept moving, and the silence around his family got louder when she brought it up. He changed the subject, or kissed her forehead, and said, soon. That word began to feel like a lie wrapped in a promise. She didn't push too hard because she was scared that, if she did, he might disappear. Then came their first real test. A family dinner he couldn't avoid. His cousin was getting married, and he invited her to come as his date. She hesitated at first, but he assured her she belonged by his side. So she wore her best red dress, straightened her hair, and put on earrings that had belonged to her late grandmother. She walked into that estate with her head high, even though her stomach twisted with nerves. The house was so big it echoed, filled with gold and glass and cold smiles. His relatives stared, their voices sweet but their eyes sharp. His mother hugged him, then turned to her with a smile so tight it could snap. You must be the nurse, she said, not using her name once during the whole night. His father didn't even shake her hand, just nodded and returned to his wine glass. Dinner was awkward, filled with fake laughs and backhanded compliments. One aunt asked if she was adopted because she looked so graceful. Another said she must be very lucky to be dating up. She smiled through all of it, gripping her fork so tightly her fingers went numb. He didn't defend her once during the meal. He looked down a lot, nervous, quiet. And that silence burned more than the words ever could. After the dinner, he apologized again and again. He said he had frozen, that he hated how they acted, but didn't want to ruin everything. She nodded, but her heart was bruised. That night, as he held her in bed, she stared at the ceiling, wondering if love was enough. She didn't need his money, didn't care about his last name, but she needed his spine, his strength to stand up when things got ugly. She wasn't just fighting for respect, She was fighting for her own dignity. In the weeks that followed, he tried harder. He introduced her to his friends. Real friends who liked her and didn't care where she came from. He posted photos of them together, tagging her proudly, slowly. The world began to see them as a couple, not a curiosity, but still, his parents said nothing. Not a word, not even a message. It was like she didn't exist in their world, and deep down, she knew that silence was not innocent. It was waiting. Building something behind closed doors, they began to talk about the future. He said he wanted to marry her someday. Maybe have 2 kids and a small house by the lake. She smiled and pretended not to feel the knot of worry in her chest, because love should feel light and easy, not like walking a tightrope over a pit of secrets. But she loved him, and she believed. He loved her, so she stayed, hoping that love could do what money and power never could, make 2 broken worlds hold hands. Even as shadows grew silently in the background, even as whispers grew into plans she could not hear, even as something buried in her past waited to rise like a storm, she still believed this was the beginning of something beautiful. She had no idea how many truths were hiding in the cracks of his golden world, and she had no clue that the same man who refused to shake her hand at dinner might actually share her blood. It was a velvet box that changed everything, small, square, and deep blue like the night sky. It sat in his hand as he knelt on one knee. She gasped. Not because she didn't expect it, but because she still couldn't believe someone like him truly wanted her forever. The restaurant around them clapped. Strangers cheered. And tears fell from her eyes as she whispered, yes. He slid the ring on her finger, a perfect fit, and kissed her like she was the most precious thing he had ever held. In that moment, everything felt possible, but not far away. Behind crystal walls and silent conversations, his parents were already preparing their answer. The news of the engagement hit them like thunder on a quiet beach. His mother didn't cry, but her jaw clenched so hard, her pearl necklace snapped. During tea, his father didn't shout, but he made 5 calls within the hour, 2 lawyers, advisors, and a woman named Linda from legal affairs. To them, this wasn't a celebration. It was a mistake that needed to be corrected. They believed he was blinded by emotion, tricked by a girl who didn't know her place. They refused to see love, only power, bloodlines, and reputation. 2 days after the proposal, she received a call. It wasn't from him, it was from his family's personal lawyer. The voice was cold, polite, and distant. He said the Winslow family had requested her presence for a formal conversation. She asked if her fiancé would be there, and the lawyer paused, then replied, "It's best if it's just you." That sentence echoed in her chest like warning bells, but she still agreed. She wanted to be brave, wanted to show them she was more than what they saw. She dressed simply that day. No fancy makeup or borrowed heels, just her favorite blazer and clean shoes. She walked into the Winslow building like a woman ready for a job interview, not a war. They sat in a cold conference room, his mother at the head of the table like a queen on a throne. His father didn't look at her. He stared at the window the entire time. The lawyer pushed a thick folder toward her, and inside it was a prenuptial agreement. "This is standard," his mother said, with a smooth, practiced smile. She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking as she read words like inheritance, separation, liability. She was stunned. If she signed this, she would walk into the marriage with nothing and leave with even less. It protected their son's wealth, assets, and name completely. She would not be allowed to touch the families, businesses, homes, or even make financial decisions as a wife. It wasn't just unfair, it was insulting, but he didn't say anything about this. She whispered, heart racing. His mother's smile didn't change. "We didn't want to burden him with the details, dear, but we're sure he'll understand." She felt like the floor was falling under her feet. This wasn't about money, it was about control. They didn't see her as a partner, a future daughter-in-law, or even a human being. They saw her as a risk, a woman to be tamed before allowed into their world. She stood up, her voice trembling but steady. "I won't sign this without speaking to him," she said. His father finally turned and spoke. "You'll sign it if you love him." Those words felt like poison. Twisting her feelings into shame, she left the building with the papers still in her bag, her steps slow and her chest heavy. When she called him that night, he sounded surprised, confused, even hurt. "They did what?" he said, his voice breaking halfway through. He drove to her apartment immediately. He didn't deny it, but said he hadn't known the terms would be that cruel. He begged her not to leave him. Said they could fix this, said he would talk to them. She cried on his shoulder, unsure if her tears came from betrayal or heartbreak. She didn't want his money, she never had. But she also couldn't let herself be treated like some gold digger from the streets. Her dignity was worth more than diamonds. In the end, he asked her for a compromise. "Please, just sign it for now," he whispered. "We'll rewrite it together later." Her heart was torn in half, one side still holding onto the boy who brought her coffee after work, the other side whispering that love shouldn't come with contracts and signatures. But she looked into his eyes, and against her better judgment, she agreed. With shaky hands, she signed the paper, and with that signature, a small part of her spirit folded like paper. Quiet and sad, they didn't celebrate the wedding after that. It was beautiful. Yes, roses and violins and a gown that made her look like a goddess. But something was missing. Something real. Something raw. His parents smiled in public, posed for photos, and handed her champagne. But every moment felt rehearsed, cold, like a stage play where she didn't know the script. She wore a ring. But she also wore a silence she couldn't explain. And though he held her hand tight at the altar, she felt like she was already walking alone. She didn't know that her past was about to rise like a ghost with a name. She didn't know that the very man who forced that pen into her hand might be carrying a secret that would change everything. Not just about the prenup, not just about the family, but about her blood, her history, her father, and what she didn't know was that the contract she signed wasn't just to protect the Winslow fortune. It was to hide a shameful truth that went back decades, a truth that had her name written all over it. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes that day. As the cameras flashed and flower petals rained down over the white marble steps, she felt hollow inside. She was now a wife legally, beautifully, painfully. People called it the wedding of the year. Magazine covers would soon show her in that dress, standing beside the billionaire heir. But none of them would know how her hands had trembled signing those papers, or how alone she had felt while surrounded by hundreds of rich strangers. She had imagined a wedding where her mother would sit in the front row, crying happy tears. Instead, her mother had refused to attend. She hadn't shouted. Hadn't Fatches looked at her daughter and said, "That family doesn't deserve your kindness." That quiet disappointment hurt more than 1,000 angry words. Still, she wore the ring, smiled for the cameras, and walked down the aisle with heavy feet. Her husband looked at her like she was his whole world, and part of her still wanted to believe that was enough. The honeymoon was far away on a private Plum Island, but even paradise can feel like a cage. She sat by the sea, staring at waves that never stopped crashing. Just like the thoughts in her head, he tried to make her laugh, tried to remind her of their love, and when he held her at night, she still felt something strong, something true. But the silence between them was no longer peaceful. It was full of unspoken things. She hadn't forgiven the way he stayed quiet in that boardroom. She hadn't forgotten the way he asked her to sign instead of stand up for her. And worst of all, she hadn't forgiven herself for doing it. When they returned from the trip, everything had changed. The mansion was hers now, or at least the part they let her live in. Staff greeted her politely, but never warmly. His mother smiled when guests were around, but never called her by name. His father had still never said a full sentence. To her, and the way he looked at her, like she was a shadow in his house, made her chest tighten one night while he was away on a business trip. She wandered the halls of the mansion alone. She paused in front of the giant family portrait near the stairs. A painting of the Winslows, dressed in royal blue, standing, tall and proud. Her husband looked barely 15 in the image, smiling with a boyish charm. Beside him stood his parents, his mother graceful, his father cold-eyed and stiff. And then there was something strange. A man in the far corner of the painting, slightly turned. She hadn't noticed him before. He wasn't like the others. He had darker skin, warmer features, and a sadness in his eyes. She stepped closer and read the tiny gold plate beneath the frame. Bryant Winslow, founding partner, it said. That name sent a sharp pulse through her chest. Bryant Winslow. She had heard it before, long ago. Whispered by her mother during a fever, she went to the library room and searched through old albums. She didn't know why, but something inside her was pushing, pulling. And then she found a photograph buried inside an old book about family legacy. It was a candid photo, not meant for framing. A young black woman with tight curls laughing. Beside the same man from the painting, her mother and him. It couldn't be. The next morning she visited her mother without warning. She placed the photo on the table and waited. Her mother stared at it for a long time, not blinking. Then finally, she said his name out loud. Bryant, she whispered. Like it hurt to speak it, tears filled her mother's eyes as the truth poured out like a wound reopening. She had worked for the Winslows as a teenager, cleaning rooms and folding towels. She had fallen in love, or maybe just believed she had, and when her belly began to grow, they fired her, paid her to leave town, and never speak of it again. Her hands trembled as she put the puzzle together. That meant the man she had just married was her half-brother, but before the shock could fully land, her mother shook her head. No, she said. That man wasn't your father. She explained that Bryant had offered to raise her when her real father ran away, but when the family found out, they erased everything: his love, his name, his place in the family. That's why he was pushed to the edge of the painting, almost hidden, almost forgotten. They erased him because he chose someone like her mother. And now, years later, history was repeating itself. She left her mother's house with a different kind of fire in her chest, not shame, not fear, but purpose. They had written her off as nothing, just a girl who got lucky. But they didn't know where she came from. They didn't know she carried the same blood they tried to bury. She was not here to beg for a seat at the table anymore. She had every right to sit at the head of it. When her husband returned, she told him everything. He was stunned, confused, then furious, not at her, but at the lies his family had told. He held her like she was the only thing that made sense in a world built on secrets. And for the first time since the wedding, she believed they were truly a team, but she also knew this was far from over, because the truth had just started to rise. And the people who built their empire on silence would do anything to protect it. What they didn't know was that the woman they tried to keep quiet had just found her voice. She hadn't meant to open that drawer. It was stuck halfway, almost jammed. Hidden in the old desk at her mother's house, she had been searching for a childhood photo, something harmless, something simple. But instead, the drawer gave her a faded envelope tied with string. Inside was a photo she had never seen before, black and white, soft at the corners, smelling faintly of dust and time. In it, her mother was laughing, holding hands with a tall man in a clean suit and a familiar smile. He looked exactly like her husband, only older, heavier, and wearing glasses. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was a mirror from another life. On the back of the photo, a name had been written in neat handwriting. Bryant Winslow underneath. It, in lighter ink, was a date that made her stomach twist. It was from the year before she was born. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at it, blinking through memories that suddenly didn't fit. The room felt colder, smaller, like the walls were listening. She brought the photo to her mother in silence, her hands shaking like leaves in the wind. Her mother didn't speak at first, just touched the edge of the picture gently. She didn't try to lie or hide it. She said she was young, poor, working as a cleaner at the Winslow summer estate. Bryant had been kind, unlike the rest. He had smiled at her, helped her carry heavy trays, made her laugh when she was too tired to smile. They had kept their love quiet, hidden in shadows behind expensive curtains and long hallways. And then one day, the secret wasn't a secret anymore. Her belly had started to grow, and the family panicked. They paid her off, fired her quietly, and sent her back to the city with silence in her pockets. But he never stopped writing. Her mother said, holding back tears. Letters came in secret, full of promises he was too scared to keep, until one day they stopped altogether. She never knew if he gave up or if someone had forced his hand, but from that point forward, she raised her daughter alone, telling her she didn't need a man. That strength was already in her bones. Now the truth weighed heavy on her chest. Her husband, the man she loved, might be the son of the very man who had once loved her mother. But something didn't add up. The timelines were off. And if Bryant had loved her mother, he couldn't have fathered both of them. Still, she needed answers, not guesses, and there was only one way to get them. She took the photo to a lab and requested a DNA test. She had a copy of her husband's father's medical records from an earlier emergency. She sent in her own cheek swab, sealed the envelope, and waited. Each day felt like 100, and every night she stared at the ceiling, wondering if she had married her own blood. She didn't eat much, didn't sleep well. Even her husband began to notice the change, asking softly, "Is something wrong?" She told him soon, "Not yet. Just wait. Please wait." When the results came, she opened them in the parking lot. The paper trembled in her hands as her eyes scanned the lines. Her breath caught, then released like a dam breaking. Not related, the test confirmed Bryant Winslow was not her biological father. The blood was not shared, not by DNA, not by law. She sobbed, right there in the car. Tears of relief and rage, and something she couldn't even name because she wasn't his daughter, but she had still been his love's daughter. And the family had still buried that part of their history in shame. Now she knew why they had made her sign that prenup so fast. They weren't protecting their son, they were protecting their secret, the shame of what Bryant had done in their eyes, loving a black woman, offering to raise a child not his. They had erased him from their story, erased her mother, erased the truth. But not completely, because truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under money and marble floors. She showed the results to her husband that night. He was quiet, then hugged her like he never wanted to let go. "I don't care who your father is," he whispered. "I care that you're mine." She believed him, but she also knew this wasn't about just the two of them anymore. This was bigger. This was about names, power, lies, and justice. And now she had proof, not just in science, but in story, in memory. In her mother's trembling voice, she carried it all now, and she wouldn't let it be hidden again. She decided to confront the one man who never spoke to her directly, the man who watched her at dinners with icy silence, the man who tried to erase her before she even entered his family. Her husband's father, the same man who had destroyed Bryant's memory. She didn't know how he would react, but she no longer feared him, because now she had her truth. And it was louder than their silence ever was. She walked into that mansion with the photo in one hand and the DNA test in the other. This time, she wasn't a guest. She wasn't a girl who got lucky. She was a storm coming to collect what was stolen, and for the first time in that house, she didn't feel small. She felt powerful because they had tried to erase her story, but now she was the one writing the next chapter. He didn't look up when she entered the room. He was seated at his desk, the sun pouring in behind him, casting long shadows on the floor. She stood silently, holding the old photo and the DNA test, her fingers tight around the edges. He knew. She was there. Of course he did, but he didn't say a word. Not a greeting, not a question, not even a breath louder than usual. The room was filled with expensive wood, books that had never been read, and the scent of power. She didn't belong there, or at least, that's what he always wanted her to believe. But today, she came not as a daughter-in-law, or a poor girl from Atlanta. Today, she came as the living evidence of everything he had buried. She walked to his desk, slow but steady, and placed the photo down first. He glanced at it briefly, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Then she placed the DNA result right beside it. The paper's crisp, undeniable. Finally, he looked up, his cold eyes meeting hers for the first time without filters. For a moment, there was something almost human in his stare, regret maybe, or fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask he wore so well. "Why now?" he asked, his voice like dry leaves underfoot. "Because you tried to make me invisible," she said quietly, "and I don't disappear." His lips pressed together, the silence stretching like wire between them. "I know everything," she continued. "I know about Bryant. I know about my mother. I know what you did to both of them." He said nothing, not a single denial. That told her more than words ever could. "You made me sign that paper because you were scared," she said. "You didn't care if I broke your son's heart." As long as I didn't break your illusion, he still didn't flinch. But his fingers tapped once against the table. "You think money fixes everything," she added, her voice rising just slightly. "But some stories can't be bought away. Some bloodlines don't care about wealth." Finally, he leaned back, his eyes scanning her like she was a piece of art he didn't know how to value. "You're not part of this family," he said slowly. "I married your son," she replied. "That makes me part whether you like it or not." He looked away, and she saw its shame, not loud, not dramatic, but real. "You remind me of him," he muttered. Too much, that was all she needed to hear. The confession without confession. He had hated Bryant's choices. So he punished his memory, and now he had tried to punish her the same way. But the difference was she fought back. She picked up the photo and the paper again, her hands steady. "I don't need your approval," she said. "I just came to say this: your silence ends here." He didn't stop her as she walked away, and for once, he didn't win. Because no amount of silence could erase the truth she now carried like armor. Back home, she told her husband everything. She showed him the papers, the photo, and recounted the entire meeting. He was quiet for a long time, pacing the room with hands on his head. Okay. Then he looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, not just for the prenup or for not speaking up sooner, but for being blind to the monster his father really was. I want to leave all of it behind," he said. "The money, the mansion, the name." She reached out and took his hand. "I don't want you to give up who you are," she whispered. "I want you to remember who you could be." They sat together in that moment. No titles, no secrets. Just two people who had seen too much and survived. But it didn't end there. The story had been awakened, and the world was watching. The Winslow family name had always been clean on the outside. But inside, cracks had begun to show. Whispers grew in corners of the media. Anonymous tips, old photos, sealed files from the past began to surface. And every road led to Bryant Winslow and to the woman standing at the center of it all. She received an invitation one morning. A local university was hosting a panel on legacy and race, and they asked her to speak. At first, she hesitated, but her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You're not just living for yourself anymore." So she said yes, and when she stood on that stage, her voice did not shake. She told the room everything, not just about the prenup or the marriage, but about the silencing of women like her mother, and the rewriting of history by those with power. People listened, people cried, people clapped, and for the first time, the truth had an audience. She didn't do it for revenge. She did it so no girl would ever again be forced to sign something that made her feel small. So no love would be buried under shame and pride. So names like Bryant would not fade from portraits just because they chose love over blood and back. At the mansion, the man who had tried to bury the past sat alone, surrounded by gold, but haunted by silence. Because the one thing he had always feared, a black woman speaking her truth, was now the one thing the world could no longer ignore. The envelope wasn't addressed to her, but it still found its way into her hands. It was thick, marked confidential, and left on the entry table of the mansion without explanation. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, tight strokes like someone trying to hide emotion behind control. She opened it slowly, already knowing it came from him. Inside were documents, dozens of them, and one letter, typed, not handwritten, because he couldn't even say sorry with his own hand. But the words hit harder than anything he had ever said in person. He confessed everything in his cold, calculated way. How he and the family elders had paid off multiple women over the years to protect the name. How they had erased not just Bryant Winslow, but others too. Women who had dared to love, dared to dream, dared to walk through the wrong doors. With the wrong skin, he admitted they had lawyers on standby, contracts pre-written, files shredded, and truth hidden under gold. And he confirmed the one thing she feared the most. He had known who her mother was the entire time. He had recognized her the night of the gala, too, and that's why the prenup wasn't just a formality, was a wall built from guilt and fear. Her breath caught as she read the last line of the letter. "I don't expect forgiveness, only your silence." That sentence lit a fire in her chest, hot and righteous. He still didn't get it. She wasn't afraid of shame anymore because it wasn't hers to carry. She folded the letter and put it in her coat. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had been saving for the right moment. The next morning, she walked into a newsroom. It wasn't a grand press conference, just a quiet office full of truth seekers with tired eyes and fast fingers. She handed the editor the documents, the photo, the DNA test, and the letter. "No edits," she said. "Tell it all." The story broke 2 days later, and it burned through the city like wildfire. People clicked, shared, whispered, shouted. Old names returned to headlines, and hidden stories were pulled from the shadows. And at the center of it all was her face, her truth, her voice. Some people called her brave. Others called her a gold digger, looking for attention. But the truth didn't care who believed it. It stood on its own. And behind closed doors, powerful men scrambled to protect what they had left. His father went silent, issuing no public statement. But his mother tried appearing on a morning show, talking about family misunderstandings and misplaced emotions. She watched the interview with a calm she had never felt before. Because now the world saw what she had seen all along. People who wore wealth like armor but bled fear when challenged. Her husband stood by her through all of it. He quit the family business and gave up his claim to the board. "I'm not proud of that name anymore," he told her one night as they lay on their small couch. They had moved into a modest home. Far from the estate, she decorated it with second-hand frames and warm lights. He cooked breakfast every Sunday, burning the eggs just enough to make her laugh. And for the first time, their love felt free. No contracts, no secrets, no shadows. But the journey hadn't been easy. She had received threats, warnings, even anonymous letters begging her to take the story down. One envelope had only 5 words in it. "You'll regret this, little nurse." She kept it taped to her wall like a trophy. A reminder of what? Fear looked like when it wore paper instead of fists, and still, she didn't back down, because every day, women wrote to her, thanking her, sharing their own stories. And she knew she was no longer just fighting for herself. Months later, she returned to the university to speak again. This time, the crowd was larger, the applause louder, but what moved her the most was seeing her mother in the front row. Her mother held her head high, dressed in her Sunday best, pride shining through every wrinkle. Afterward, she hugged her tightly and whispered, "You turned our silence into power." And in that moment, all the pain, the judgment, the contracts, and cruelty melted into something pure. Justice, not the courtroom kind, but the kind that lives in truth, finally spoken out loud. Back at home, she opened a new letter. It was from the Historical Society. They were restoring a Winslow painting. They wanted to include the missing partner, and they asked if she would speak at the unveiling. She smiled and looked at the photos still taped to her fridge. Bryant, standing with her mother, laughing like the world had no edges. She said yes without hesitation, because this time his name wouldn't be hidden. It would be displayed in gold, under lights, in front of the very people who once tried to forget him. Her story was not about revenge, not about taking down a family. It was about making sure no woman ever walked into love with fear on her shoulders. It was about turning shame into legacy. And no matter how many tried to silence her, she had already won because she found her voice and the world had listened. They gave her a seat at the front, but she didn't sit down right away. Instead, she stood in front of the large velvet curtain, heart steady, hands calm. She looked at the crowd gathered for the unveiling: reporters, historians, students, old men in tailored suits, and young women with notebooks. But she wasn't nervous this time, not even a little, because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about restoring something that should have never been taken away. The director stepped forward and adjusted the microphone. He gave a short speech about history, mistakes, and correcting narratives long overdue. Then he handed the moment to her. She took the mic, looked around the room, and began to speak in a voice both soft and unshakable. "My mother once cleaned the floors of the Winslow estate. And no one learned her name," she said, "but Bryant Winslow did." And for a brief, honest moment in time, he saw her, not as a servant, but as a woman. There were no gasps, no whispers, just silence, respectful and focused. She spoke for 5 minutes, not reading from paper, but from memory. She spoke of love hidden in shadows, letters burned, lives erased to protect a brand, and how even so, truth survived, carried by blood, memory, and courage. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet, not clapping wildly, but standing in quiet unity. Then the curtain was pulled back, and the new painting was revealed. There he was, Bryant Winslow, standing side by side with the woman he had once loved. Not in the corner, not faded, not forgotten. They were front and center now. Honored in gold and canvas, their story no longer whispered, but displayed for all to see. Her mother, sitting in the front row, wiped a tear from her cheek. It wasn't a sad tear, it was a release, a breath she'd held for over 30 years. The past had not changed, but it had been seen, and that alone gave her peace. After the event, strangers came to her, not just to thank her, but to confess their own buried stories. A young woman spoke about her grandmother who was forced into silence. An older man admitted he had watched a love story fall apart because his family said no. Each voice added a thread to something bigger than her. It was no longer just about what happened to her. It was about what had happened to so many. She and her husband walked through the garden afterward. Hand in hand, they had been through storms together. But Now the sun finally felt real on their skin. He no longer wore his family's name like a badge. It was just part of his past now, not his identity, and she, for the first time in her life, felt whole, not because of marriage or wealth or revenge, but because she had stood in truth and the world didn't break her. She turned her pain into something living. A foundation was born, the Legacy Project. It gave legal aid and emotional support to women caught in power imbalances. It documented lost stories, restored forgotten names, and challenged old systems built to silence. And it all started with a prenup, a photo, and a woman who refused to shrink. Years later, a little girl stood in front of that painting in the museum. She was brown-skinned, curly-haired, and curious. She looked up at the woman beside Bryant and asked her teacher, "Who is she?" The teacher smiled and said, "That's the mother of the woman who changed everything." And the little girl said softly, "I want to be like her, in a house far from the estate." Filled with laughter, plants, and second-hand books, she sat on the porch, watching the sky change colors. Her husband brought her tea, kissed her forehead, and sat beside her. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Their love had already survived its trial. What remained now was life. Not perfect, but deeply real. She sometimes thought about the mansion, the signatures, the rooms she once tiptoed through, and she felt nothing, no anger, no fear, no hunger for revenge. Because she had everything that mattered, her name, her truth, her voice, and now generations would know not just her story, but the story of every woman who had ever been asked to stay quiet. They tried to silence her with paper. They tried to contain her with rules. They tried to erase her with wealth. But she didn't break. She didn't bow. And in the end, the woman they feared most wasn't loud or violent. She was simply honest. And that was enough to change the world.